Now, staggering story in the Daily Telegraph today. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of the program, the nation's in the middle of a housing crisis, and it extends to people who are simply trying to get into public housing. I say simply, but the waiting list in one state, New South Wales alone, there's over 57,000 people on a waiting list. I mean, how could that be? And I imagine the number's not much different in other states right around the country. But the Telegraph has discovered that taxpayers are forking out $160 million, let me repeat the number, $160 million a year to cover the cost of housing people who are waiting on these waiting lists or homeless people in motels and hotels. They'd otherwise be out on the streets. The man who broke that story in the Daily Telegraph is James Willis, an old colleague of mine from 2GB. He joins us now. James, a hell of a lot of money, $160 million.
Steve, no doubt about that, and good to see you again. I stumbled across this figure by mistake when I was investigating why the housing crisis is continuing in New South Wales, and some of these big projects that were promised 4 or 5 years ago have been stalled or fallen over. This is a tragic set of circumstances for people that, if it weren't for these stopgap measures, which is nightly rates in motels and hotels, and there's a range of hotels across Sydney that have commercial agreements with the state government to house people for a night or a week or a month that would otherwise be homeless. So on one hand, yes, it is an outrageous amount of money. But on the other, if it weren't for this $160 million for motels and hotels, we would have a situation like in San Francisco, like in other parts of the world, where the streets were tragically flooded by homeless people. So this is a metaphor for the crisis that we're in, and it just shows how urgently and how far behind we are on meeting those housing targets that we so desperately need at a time when we're bringing in hundreds of thousands of migrants into the country, plus international students, visa holders and everything else.
Well, the migrant question's a great one. I'll get to that with you in a second. But this makes me think that either the New South Wales government is very, very, very kind-hearted, or the New South Wales government, and I suspect other Labor governments in other jurisdictions, don't want the bad look of hundreds and hundreds of people living on the streets. Which one do you think it is?
Well, I agree with you. I think they are desperate to avoid a scenario where you have homeless people all over Sydney. We've seen homeless camps in Martin Place near the Reserve Bank, but this crisis would be far more. It could be thousands, tens of thousands more if we weren't using hotel rooms and motel rooms to house people that are on this public housing wait list, some of them for 5 years, some of them for 10 years. And it seems like, having spoken to a few people that are in this situation, they're basically, it's this massive scrambling exercise to say, well, we've got this person in that motel room for a week, then we have a family coming in, so we have to kick them out. We need to find a spot for them. And the whole issue is the result of not having enough affordable housing and being a mile behind on our housing targets. The best thing Chris Minns, the New South Wales Premier, could do at the moment would be to shut up about the 75,000 homes he needs to build every year, because at the moment, it's a simply impossible target to reach. And the more they go on about this target that they have to reach, the further they're going to fail within 12 months, 24 months and beyond.
James, do we know if some of these people who are, squatting in these motels at our expense, are they migrants? Are they people who have come into the country, or are they people who long-term on the waiting list for public housing? Do we know?
Well, that's a good question, because when we did the story about the homeless camp out the front of the Reserve Bank building in Martin Place, and they were eventually moved on a few weeks later, we discovered that a number of the people that were sleeping rough were not Australian citizens and were migrants, had been here on short-term visas or some form of visa. And as a result of that, they were not entitled to the same level of care and accommodation as Australian citizens were. So I think that kind of answers the question for you, Steve. But the bigger issue here is that when you are allowing 500,000 migrants to come to New South Wales over the next 5 years, that's what the budget papers say. They're not my figures, they're budget papers. When you allow foreigners to buy new homes, and we don't have really strict rules around foreign investment when it comes to housing, and when you your universities are, so heavily reliant on international students who, sure, have their own form of accommodation, but we need to start looking at what's going on in our own backyard and sorting out the crisis here before we start saying, well, it's an easy revenue stream to allow more migrants to come here. We need the jobs, everything else. I mean, I think for the average Australian, that argument no longer passes the pub test. And if spending $160 million on motels and hotels for people that would otherwise be homeless is not the best argument you'll hear today, I don't know what is.
The government's got a lot of questions to answer. Just finally, I was in Sydney a week ago, driving over the Harbour Bridge southbound. On the left-hand side is that apartment tower that used to be public housing. It's all been tricked up, and I presume those apartments have been sold off to private owners. So we are actually hollowing out or emptying out some public housing that we already had.
That's right. And the other example we highlighted today was at Telopia near Parramatta in Sydney, where 5,000 new homes were promised by a developer 5 years ago, plus a new library, plus a new community centre. And that project is now in limbo. The developer says it's now expensive, the market conditions have changed, so they're trying to renegotiate with the state government. So that's 5,000 homes that are in limbo. But you've also got to understand, Steve, we've got an industry that we're relying on to fix this problem, which is littered with insolvencies, and which a number of people that are in that industry that say we've got tiny little margins to deal with, or did previously, they've now been hit by labour costs, they've been hit by the cost of materials, they've been hit by slow DAs, and all these things stack up. And that's why you're seeing so many of these big construction companies fall over. Plus, the actions of the CFMEU, which has been acknowledged, contributes to the cost of large-scale buildings. And this is the industry that we're relying on to fix one of the biggest issues, if not the biggest issue in the country. And the construction industry is saying to anyone that will listen, the only way we can fix this problem is with sensible targets. The higher you go and the harder you go, corners get cut, and we have more and more firms go out of business. This is an industry that is not stable, and yet they're the ones that are expected to fix this problem.
James, great work. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Steve.